Hi guys, it's JFK Assassination researcher Rachel Elrod, and this video I'm going to do something slightly different, and I'm going to present kind of a challenge to us all really in asking the questions. If you've kind of followed me on my channel or on my research for a while, you'll know that my mantra is ask the questions, ask the questions, ask the questions, because when we're brave enough to ask the pertinent questions and the questions in our mind that the evidence and the we're reviewing evidence and we're reviewing things, it leads us to ask questions, and we should never be scared of that. We should always dive deep, and we should ask the questions that are forming in our mind as we read different resources, different things, because asking the questions, asking the hard questions, the deep questions, the difficult questions, gets us to the truth of the matter very often. And I want us to remember that it's the asking of the questions that the media and the narrative and the set propaganda wants to shut down. So this is really, really, really important. And some of the answers I have addressed, and Richard and I have addressed together in our books, Takedown, Killer Queen and Endgame, that I wrote in tribute to Richard. So, okay, so the first question I want to ask us is, let me just consult my notes. Why were there reports going out on the TV that there were 3 different weapons found in the Texas School Book Depository on the day? All right. So we know that the single bullet theory developed by Arlen Specter and the final conclusion of the Warren Commission was that JFK was shot by one sniper, Lee Harvey Oswald, from behind from the sniper's nest of the School Book Depository with a weapon, a rifle called the Mannlicher Carcano, the 6.5 Mannlicher Carcano. Okay. Now, on the TV, though, on the day, there were reports of a Mauser, an Argentine Mauser being found, and a British 303 Enfield being found on the roof, as well as the Mannlicher Carcano, which was then paraded by Lieutenant Carl Day of the Dallas Police at 6:15 p.m. on the day of the assassination. Now, here's the interesting thing that I want us to all think about. Whilst the MC was being paraded for the TV crews, for the cameras, and going out on live TV by the Dallas Police, the bullet that we know as CE399, at the same moment in time, was being transferred by the FBI from the head of the FBI, from the head of the Secret Service, James Rowley, to the FBI ballistics department headed up by Robert Frazier. Okay, CE399 was en route to the FBI ballistics lab, and it is being recorded as received by the ballistics lab, Robert Frazier, at 7:30 p.m. There's an hour time difference. Washington is an hour ahead. So we are talking about a 15-minute time difference between the MC being paraded at Dallas and CE399 being logged in as evidence at the ballistics lab in Washington. Okay, now this is really important because the link of the Mannlicher Carcano and CE399 as the bullet is the whole basis on which Oswald is now charged for as the sole perpetrator, the lone assassin for JFK. So the question is, how could anybody link these 2 material pieces of evidence together enough to charge Lee Harvey Oswald on the 22nd of November 1963, when these 2 pieces of evidence are not even in the same location? That is the question. So I want you to think about that. The next day, Seymour Weitzman, who found the Mauser up on the 6th floor. The next day, Saturday the 23rd, writes an affidavit to say that it's a Mauser, but it's already gone out on the TV at this point, and it's already been known, because this is part of the narrative, the story of where it's going, that this weapon fired by Lee was a Mannlicher Carcano. So here is the question. How does that work? How does that work? Okay. Now, question number 2. Why did Clint Hill and the Secret Service team there, so Roy Kellerman, William Greer and Jackie, why did they insist, and I mean insist, when I say I mean insist, because they absolutely screamed and shouted and cussed and pushed and forcefully removed the bronze casket from Parkland at the protest of Earl Rose. Now, there's a whole other story about Earl Rose, which I've gone into before. Okay, but the question is, why did they push for that casket, the body of JFK, to go back to Love Field, to go back to Washington, knowing full well, they would have known full well anyway, without Earl Rose telling them, that that action is A, illegal, and B, breaks the chain of custody. So why would you do that? Why would that happen? Okay, because at this point, 2 p.m, when all of this is happening in the corridor at Parkland, remember, Lee Oswald was arrested at 1:50. So they've even got a guy in custody, arrested for the perpetration of the murder of JFK, and yet they're pushing for something which would potentially undermine that conviction, should it be the truth. So the question is, why did they do that? Okay, now I want you to think about that very, very carefully, because there is actually only one reason why you would do that. Okay, question number 3. How did the autopsy of the century get bodged? Okay, so we know that they chose Bethesda, Jackie chose Bethesda to have JFK's autopsy. Okay, now some crazy stuff happened at Bethesda, which I've gone into before. But basically, for those who perhaps don't quite get it or understand the scenario here, when the autopsy was being conducted, all right, there were no qualified forensic pathologists present who were qualified enough to undertake this kind of pathological autopsy. Okay, and there were 3 people that was supposed to be qualified: Humes, Commander Humes, Boswell, and Pierre Fink. Okay, and they between them came to different ideas, and notes were burnt, and x-rays were changed, and accounts were destroyed and rewritten. Okay, so they weren't written in the autopsy room at the time. They were resubmitted later. So that in itself breaks the chain of evidence. But in essence, that doesn't matter, because the whole of the autopsy was completely illegal, and therefore would be invalid in a court of law, because it should have been under the legal process carried out in Dallas. So it doesn't really matter in some regards what happened or what didn't happen in the autopsy room, because all of it's invalid. But we're talking about the President of the United States, and procedure not just wasn't followed, was absolutely constitutionally, legally ripped, shred to shred, ripped apart. So the question has to be why? Because that action has denied JFK justice. However else you want to look at it, however else you want to view it in terms of who was involved and who was not involved, this action has denied JFK as a man, under the Constitution, under the legal process, justice, of which you and I and everyone else under our country's laws are perfectly entitled to. So the question has to be, why? Okay. Right. My next question is, how come the Kennedy family supports the Warren Commission conclusions of one shooter from behind, Lee Harvey Oswald, one man, 3 shots, and a single bullet theory, basically? How do they hold that position to this day, and why do they hold that position to this day, when we have conclusively shown through all of our research, the entire community now, JFK research community now, understands that there was a conspiracy, and yet they're still holding on to this lone nut theorem that's presented by the Warren Commission. So my question is, if you want justice as a family for your loved one, why would you still hold on to that position? Why would the family be allowed to hold on to the material evidence in this case? After the assassination, Bobby Kennedy was allowed to hold on to JFK's Cartier watch, okay, or have it cleaned. He had it cleaned, and he had it shipped to Jackie. The family hold the material evidence. In fact, CE399 was as well swapped into the evidence box. So I've got to the place in my research where I know that, but the actual bullet that was taken off the stretcher at Parkland, which we will call the Tomlinson bullet after the guy that found it, is in the possession, or was certainly in the possession, of Bobby Kennedy and the Kennedy family. Okay, and also the brain of JFK has gone missing and is said to be in the possession of the Kennedy family, along with Jackie's pink suit, which is not available for investigation or viewing in the public domain whatsoever, out of request by the Kennedy family. So here's the question: why is a family allowed to hold on to the material evidence in a case in any regard, and why are they allowed to dictate non-disclosure or terms of not being able to view those things? Why is that? Why is that? Because my understanding is, president or not, political family or not, the Constitution of the USA means that all men are equal under the law. So why do some rules apply to some people and not others? Because that to me is just a case of being, having enough wealth and enough power and enough kind of political clout to dictate the terms. Well, that should not be occurring in a society such as the USA, where all men are equal under the law. That was my understanding, that all men, all people are equal under the law. So that should not be allowed to happen. So the question is, why is it happening? Okay, so those are my questions. I want to just talk about a couple of books that are Richard's books, because when he came to be with me, he brought about a third of his library, not just JFK research books. He bought some other books as well, but I've got over about 150 JFK assassination research books that he bought. So I'm going to talk about a few of them. The first one is called The Inheritance. Now, this is an amazing, amazing book. Okay, so the question that has arisen in my mind from reading this book, or part of this book, is that here's a question. On the morning of the assassination, back at the Fort Worth Hotel, Kennedy was asked by his aides and his Secret Service team to relinquish all of his metal items from his person. So jewelry, his watch, his money. He had a money clip. They didn't really carry, Kennedys don't really carry cash. So anything that was metal, he was asked to hand over. And the reason that they gave him was that it was for a radiation check. Now, you can believe what you like about a radiation check or not. But the question is then, if there was a radiation check and there was a security issue, why was Jackie allowed to wear her wedding ring, bracelets, and she had metal hoops in her purse where it was clipped together? So it looks like one rule for him and one rule for her, and that doesn't make sense until we realise, of course, that in past assassination attempts, one president had a piece of paper, his speech and something else in his top pocket, and that deflected the bullet. So you see, if you're going to set somebody up for an assassination, you want to make sure that nothing's going to deflect the weapon, the bullets from hitting the body and being effective, aren't you? So the easiest way to do that is to feign some kind of reason as to get rid of all the metal items that that person may be carrying. In my mind, that makes sense. So that's come about because of this book and the information about the Cartier watch. The JFK had two watches around that kind of time, and Jackie had taken the Cartier, or the Cartier watch had been surrendered. Okay, so JFK had no watch on the plane from Fort Worth to Love Field. And this book reveals that Jackie gave him a different watch, okay, on the plane on the way, which was probably more of a leather strap that he wore, okay. And that watch ended up going missing, okay. So this book's amazing. This book's amazing. Okay, so another question. We've read this book. Aubrey Reich was the guy that was working for O'Neill's funeral home. He was one of the ambulance crew that took the man with the epileptic seizure from the plaza to Parkland. So it places him, gives him reason to be at Parkland Hospital just ahead of the assassination. Now, it's interesting that O'Neill's funeral home were also the same funeral home that supplied the bronze casket. Aubrey, in this book, reveals that Father Oscar Huber, okay, by process of elimination and from the accounts here, we know that Father Oscar Huber went in to give JFK the last rites twice. So the question is, I mean, that account's been fudged to make it look like once, but when we've unpacked it, it looks to me that Oscar Huber went into that trauma room twice to give the last rites. And so the question is, why? Why? I want you to think about that. Then we read this book, Wesley Frazier. Wesley Frazier. So there's a few questions for Wesley Frazier. Few. Why did it take him 58 years to tell us that he saw a gunman, gun in hand on the knoll? Now, if you believe that, well, that's up to you. This is what Wesley's saying in this book, that he forgot about it. It was too traumatic. He couldn't remember it. And now suddenly, after all this time, he remembers seeing a gunman on the knoll. Bit late in the day to tell us, I think. Bit late in the day to tell us. But the real question for Wesley, there's lots of real questions, is how come Wesley Frazier is the only person, the only account to tell us that Lee came in on that Friday morning from the car parking lot behind the TSBD with a package in hand that was purported to be the curtain rods, to be the rifle package. How come no one else saw Lee Harvey Oswald walk in the door, either the front door or the back door of the TSBD with that package? Nobody has ever told us this. Now, there's another question for Wesley Frazier. How come he talks about a roll call from the TSBD? There is no evidence of a roll call, that the staff were assembled and ticked off a list. Okay, none at all. We have a list of employees. That's not the same thing. And then Wesley goes on to tell us that Lee Harvey Oswald, I mean, it says it in black and white in this book, Lee Harvey Oswald was the only employee not present at that roll call. Okay, now that is not true. Okay, this is not true start to finish, because they put that building on lockdown after the assassination, and we have photographic evidence that Danny Arce, who was one of the warehouse men there, and Billy Nolan Lovelady, at least, and a few others, were at the Dallas Police Department. Those two men particularly were. There's photographic evidence of both of them being there, but other people left the building also, and it got put onto lockdown. And obviously after that point, nobody was coming in and nobody was going out for several hours. In fact, one of the newsmen couldn't get out the building and chucked a reel of film out of the window to the waiting colleagues so they could get it on the TV and aired. So we know that the building was on lockdown. So why does Wesley tell us that this story, which is not true? Okay, it's not true. So the question is, why? All right, now, I know some of the answers to these questions, but I really want you guys to think about what's gone on here, because we've got lies, we've got deception, and we've got questions that need answering. And when we start to answer some of these questions, we build a picture that brings us to a bigger conclusion, okay? And in the first instance, the conclusion is that Lee Harvey Oswald was not a lone shooter or even a shooter at all, okay? And once we get to that place, we know that the conspiracy, because we are talking about conspiracy after that point, must be further, wider and deeper than we've ever known. And we start to unpack it when we ask the questions and get to the answer. So this is why this is so important. So I just want us to think about those things, and come and talk to me, and obviously read our books. They're all available on Amazon. So bye for now.